Good morning. I'm Peter Klingman, the Mildred and Doyle Carlton Jr. Curator for the Resource Center of Florida History and Politics here at the University of South Florida. And this morning it's both my privilege and a pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Len Colodny, who is, for those of us in July of 1999 reading the newspaper locally, know that he has agreed to give a very significant collection to the University of South Florida's library in the Department of Special Collections. And we make these tapes, and this particular tape in particular, so that researchers and students and interested citizens will have an opportunity to hear from Mr. Colodny how and why and what the purpose of the organization of the collection is really meant to be from his perspective. And certainly we hope that those who watch this tape in years to come will find it easier to get a grip on all of the material connected to the issue of the Nixon presidency, which is the subject of Mr. Colodny's donation to the university. Morning, Len.
Good morning, Peter.
Let's start with some basic biographical material. Where were you born? How'd you grow up? Things of that sort.
I was born in Washington, D.C. at Garfield Hospital in January 21st, 1938. Garfield isn't there anymore, and neither am I. I grew up in Washington, went to Barnard Elementary School, McFarland Junior High School, and McKinley Tech High School, which is also no longer there, nor am I. I was a pretty fair student, about a C student. My family came from over in Minsk in the Russia area, Polish and Russian Jews, driven from the continent to come to America. I was second generation American, a native Washingtonian. We had a very interesting house. My father got a law degree but couldn't pass the bar in New York and ended up in the liquor business. Very bright man. Sam Colodny was of great humor, a passion for politics, a real gut passion. They came out of the Depression. They married in the Depression. We all cried when Roosevelt died, and I don't know why I cried because I was only 7 years old, but we all cried. My sister is 2.5 years younger than I am. She's a state senator in Maryland, so the political passion goes on. We have a minor difference in our professions. She's a 20-year political professional, and I investigate politicians, and sometimes that gets pretty nasty at the dinner table.
I'll bet.
What are you looking at now, Len? My sister Paula. My mother Ethel was a stay-at-home mom, and we had a very wonderful family life. We really did, in those days, the roots were really laid. I mean, my father, coming out of the Depression, making a success, but also not well, had a number of heart attacks, but a very passionate man. And my mother would later enter politics as a precinct chairman. So politics was sort of the centerpiece of our lives, even though none of us were professional politicians, nor aspired to be at the time. And we had our usual battles, disagreements. As we moved into the 60s, we had some very big disagreements between my dad and I, particularly over the Vietnam War. Those years, particularly the late 50s, when I graduated high school in 1957, and I was president of my class. I don't know how that happened. I don't normally win popularity contests, but for some reason they chose me. Coming out of high school, the end of the 50s up to the middle of the 60s, or just slightly beyond, we had this deep passion, not just to go to college for the sake of getting a job, but we had causes. And I think these causes sprung from the 30s and the 40s into the 50s. The 50s was sort of the Leave It to Beaver, but my generation, as we reached high school, we're looking for some values, something that, and civil rights became a cause that I just, for a very good reason. When Brown versus Board of Education came down in 1954, I was in a school, McKinley Tech High School, which had attendance of 900 but could hold 3,000. The thing was, we were all white, and D.C., District of Columbia in those days, was segregated. And I remember the impression that made on me. The decision came down in June or May from the Supreme Court that banned segregation in schools. And immediately, the black schools wanted to, in those days we called them the Negro schools, because Washington, you must understand, is really a southern city, not a,
right.
In spite of the fact
Sure.
that it was the capital against the Confederacy, it had very much a southern tinge to it. And I remember those days so well because immediately they wanted to take it and fill up our school with black people, and those 900 white people were really scared. But it wasn't going to happen until the following September. And I remember it well. The first day we went to school was September of that year, and we were going to be one of the first schools integrated in the United States. And I could see there was trouble brewing. There was calls for strikes. Somebody claimed to have been raped. I mean, we went through some tremendous turmoil. And by the time I graduated, here I am. I picked McKinley Tech because I wasn't a great student, and I really wanted to go to a school where they weren't expecting great things. So when I went to Tech, it was a different world. I had a choice to go to a school which had a large Jewish population, which was my own background, and I ended up in a school where there were 4 Jews. When I went to graduate as president of the class, I had two things. One, I was told that it was tradition that the president could pick the person who'd do the benediction and the invocation and so on. And I said, well, look, I understand I'm one of 3 Jews, and I certainly will find a very good Reformed rabbi who I happen to like, Rabbi Brickner, quite a bit, who would later marry me. And he came to talk, and I insisted that the vice president pick his for the end. So we had that type of split. But there was a really horrible problem. We had a prom. And what were we going to do with these black kids at this white prom? And I said, what we're going to do is we're going to have blacks and whites together. But what if the whites wanted girls dance with a black boy, or a Negro boy, as they said in those days? And I remember it well. We had the prom at the DuPont Circle Hotel, and we pulled it off. They wanted to cancel it. I wouldn't let them cancel it. No, we're going to have it. And whoever comes, comes. So that was my first experience, and it led me into raising money for Freedom Riders to go south to sit-ins. There was a passion and a real feel that you were doing something beyond going to college and earning a degree and making money. And I'm very proud of that group that came in. The 60s is sort of looked back on as hippies and so on. This wasn't hippies. These were serious matters, and we were college kids. I did go to D.C. Teachers College first with my C average. I wasn't going to Harvard or Yale. I didn't stay very long there, and I ended up at Montgomery Junior College. Mm-hmm. I worked my way through junior college. I never graduated. I'm 3 credits short of getting an AA. I don't know what that means, quite frankly. My wife says it's caused me to be a failure in life. I must go back and get those 3 credits.
Oh, we have to get you an honorary degree from someplace.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a matter of pride of those years. And my father liked and my mother liked what I was doing then, and really enjoyed it. I think they were proud of it. At the same time, I was going into business with my father in 1960, which put me in the liquor brokerage business. I was selling private label liquor, the store's own brand. And it's tough when you're working with your father. My father had a wonderful sense of humor and a great reputation. So I was greeted warmly wherever I went, but it was used based on being Sam's son. But since Sam wasn't a political activist and his son was, and in the business world, being a political activist is not necessarily the best thing that can happen to you, especially if you're pushing civil rights in 1960, 61, and so on. So that part of my life shaped, I think, where I was going to end up. It turned out by the 70s I wasn't going to be a businessman anymore. That I had a passion for politics. I was involved in the 60s. As I said, I was also involved in local county politics. We had a commissioner form of government, and we wanted to go to charter government, which would give us a council and a county executive and so on. We wanted to get rid of the old zoning policies and stuff. I got involved in that. Then I got involved in school board races. And so it just sort of naturally grew. The family was not deeply religious. My father did not go to the synagogue on a regular basis, but we believed in the Ten Commandments. Not that we were going to tack them on the wall. I know that would distress Congress. I didn't have the Ten Commandments tacked on the wall, but it was in my heart and in my soul. And in 1957, my sister had a New Year's Eve all-girls sleepover, and I had just gotten over the flu and didn't have a date and wasn't going out. And she brought her girlfriends there, and that's where I met my wife, Sandra Colodny, or Sandy Price in those days. And she was there for a sleepover, and we spent all night talking. She was 16, I was 19. And we're still married. We married 4 years later. We have 2 children. We have Sherry Colodny Hollis, who is here at USF in the Department of Public Health, I believe, as a meeting planner. Son John, who's over on the West Coast. He's the businessman on the East Coast. I'm sorry, he's in Miami. He'll kill me for that. He's a wheeler dealer in computer businesses. He's constantly talking about going into this internet company, that internet company. Sandy, my wife, works at the Department of Anesthesiology, USF, at Tampa General Hospital. So we have a lot of ties to USF. We're an interesting family from the standpoint where we all have different points of view, some of us more active than others.
Well, let me ask you a question. I mean, and it's great to hear that biographical emphasis on passion and causes, because you became, according to the material you sent me on your bio, a committed investigative reporter with an uncanny ability, I think somebody wrote about you, to ferret out facts. How do you walk from political activist to investigative reporter? I mean, I understand the connection, but I think people might be interested in focusing down. Before we get to why Nixon, the first part of it ought to be why investigative reporting.
Yeah, the more I think about why it happened, I have to go back to those tests you took in high school. They were, I don't know what you call them. They were comprehensive tests to find out what you were best adapted for, and how you were doing in English and math and so on. And I would go to my counselor, and I had real trouble with math and science and that type of thing. I did fine in English, and I was on the school newspaper and with the school basketball team, and I loved basketball and a lot of it. But when they start telling me how I scored, there was one thing I scored really high on, and it was called spatial relations. And I didn't know what in the hell spatial relations were. So I went through most of my life having scored like a 99 on spatial relations and not knowing what the heck it meant. And I think that's what got me into investigative reporting. I now understand what it means. It's taking disparate things and being able to put them together. You've probably seen them. There's this sequence,
Right.
And how do they fit together? I now am told, this late in life, that this is a unique talent. It was innate. I had always wanted to do journalism. I was on the school newspaper at McKinley Tech. I worked as a stringer for the Washington Post. I enjoyed sitting down and talking to reporters. And in the days when I was, just before I entered county government in 1973, the Post would always have, the Washington Post would always have young reporters out who would cover the counties first before they would cover the big stuff. And so a line and succession of reporters would come, and I was number one on their list to take to lunch. I had more lunches on the Washington Post than you could shake a stick at.
We better identify for everybody why that was happening because of the position you held. We should do that.
Well, I was involved in local politics, and again, I understood how it worked. I understood how the politicians thought, who was connected to who, which person was really fronting for these people. And this is stuff a reporter just loves. If they can figure out how the system works, that's what made me unique. I was in government and in politics before I went into journalism. So as a result, I'd sat in the room with other politicians as we tried to figure out how to fool the press and throw them a bit of red meat and really mean something else. So I knew that kind of piece of paper when it came in front of me. And so I would go out and explain to them, this person is really a front for this person, and it's about money and where the money was coming from. And I think you're quoting Loretta Tafani, who was a Pulitzer Prize winner when she was at the Post. She kept saying, Len, I don't know how you do it. But I sort of was like the guy you pass on. In 1973, once we got charter government, Bill Gullett, who was a Republican, I'm a liberal Democrat. I think he's a moderate Republican. And what he wanted from me was to join the Human Relations Commission. We had a police force that just had a reputation for beating up black people. I walked into Bill Gullett's office, and he said, look, I got 160 brutality complaints, Len. I want you to see what you do to make them go away. Well, I didn't know anything about this. I had never been a policeman, never had a clue as to what it was all about other than what I had seen visually. Talk to me about politics, but not about policing. Well, my natural instinct was to learn. I said, it's going to take me 6 months to learn. I joined the Human Relations Commission, and I was immediately made chairman of what was called the Law Enforcement Practices Panel. And not knowing any better, I went out and started telling the chief of police what we were going to do and what he was going to do. And I said, bigotry starts at the top. And Chief Schweitzer, who'd been there for many, many years and was part of the landed gentry, and here comes this short Jew into his offices saying, hey, look, fella, let me tell you how we're going to start treating black people and what I want your guys to do. I didn't quite do it that way. I was a little more polished, but the end result was I started teaching at the Police Academy, Human Relations. We built we were the civilian oversight, so we investigated the police. But, of course, the police went and got themselves their own Bill of Rights so that you couldn't subpoena them, you couldn't do this to them, you couldn't do that to them. I think we have it here in Florida as well now. But I came in saying, look, this has to be a win-win situation. We can't turn around every 3 weeks and find a story that you shot somebody or beat somebody up, and nothing's ever founded. And so we started by trying to understand each other. And Chief Schweitzer was just a very fine gentleman, and he understood times had changed, and he understood my job. The blacks on the commission didn't really want to see a white guy in my job. They really felt it should go to a black person. And at first were very wary of the appointment and were sure that I was nothing more than a political hack that Mr. Gullett was putting in to keep the lid on things. So I went about and did my job, and a lot of good things came from it. By the time I left, we reduced police brutality complaints to about 15 a year from that 160. Things weren't being whitewashed. I got subpoena power, and I subpoenaed the new chief, John Rhodes, who I also became friends with, he and his family. But he understood where the line was drawn. And John helped bring the police department into the modern era. We had one of the first rape crisis centers. That was an idea I had in 1973, where a woman would never have to go into a police station if she was raped. She didn't even have to see a policeman. But they would come to her at the hospital, preferably a female officer. Then somebody from the state's attorney would be assigned to her for her case so we could get convictions. I was very proud of that. That was a real accomplishment. Getting and teaching and doing the things I was able to do when I left, not only did the National Conference of Christians and Jews give me their humanitarian award, but so did the Fraternal Order of Police. I knew I had done my job, and I knew that's what I was there for. And I said, well, you know what? I think I'll run for the state senate. Done so well. But, of course, I ran as an independent and took no special interest money, finished second in the Democratic primary to the machine candidate, and came to the conclusion I really wasn't ever going to get elected, and if I did, I'd be the unhappiest guy in the world in the state Senate. I'd be sitting segregated from everybody who was paid and bought for, and so that sort of led me out of the liquor business into politics, and then I got a contract to evaluate the Montgomery County, Maryland liquor department. It's the only county liquor department in the United States. There are states that sell liquor, and you have to buy from state stores. This is the only county. So I go there, and all my reporter friends follow me. At this time, the Post people were working for Bob Woodward. He was the managing editor for the Metro section. So Loretta Tafani was covering me, as had Jackson Deal and John Feinstein. I have to go down and list it. John Feinstein's on the bestseller list now. He does a book on golf. But in those days, John was a reporter out in Prince George's County, or Montgomery County, which is the neighboring county. In any event, I did too good a job. I found out that brands were selling there that sold nowhere else, but they happened to be sold to the county by the campaign person for the county executive who had hired me to find this out. And I went in on the first day, and I asked very basic questions, like to Mr. Passmore, who was the director, had never been in the liquor business. And I said to him, tell me, how much does it cost you to take a case of Smirnoff vodka from Connecticut and Hartford, where it's produced, to your shelf? What's the cost? He says, I don't know. I said, do you know the cost of any liquor that you bring in? We don't have it broken down. I mean, what do you mean you don't have it broken down? How do you know what to charge? He says, well, when we see our profit margin drop, we raise it by 2%. I said, wait, this is the nuttiest thing I ever heard. Meanwhile, they're busy hiring the deputy director for that job, and he's the friend of the guy who's selling them. He's the nephew of the guy that's selling them the liquor. Well, when they saw my numbers, they called me up and said, Len, you got it wrong. You don't understand. You're doing alcohol, beer, and wine separately. Now, if you mix them all together, that percentage goes way down. I said, you mix them all together, and I look like an idiot. So we were now at loggerheads. And I was offered jobs, civil service jobs. You know, Len, how would you like to be director of the emergency planning? Emergency what? I don't know anything about emergencies. At least I knew something about the liquor department. They offered me jobs, and they tried to get me to change my report. And as it was happening, as that was all happening, when they offered me the jobs, I tape recorded. Because I had a feeling the day was going to come when we were going to be at loggerheads, and they were going to say it never happened. And it came, and it happened. And it was through that I came to meet Bob Woodward, and sort of that's how we journeyed into investigative reporting. I met Robert Redford. I was brought down to the set of the Washington Post, which is what you see in the movie, and Jason Robards came by and waved, and Robert Redford came in and said hello, and it was David Marinus, who was then deputy editor to Woodward. They all wanted the transcripts of those tapes. And without going into great detail, but just to say that I'm sure part of the collection will be some of those tapes, Mr. Woodward at work was a piece of work. He made commitments to me that he didn't live up to, and he wrote fraudulent news stories. And so what started out to be a job looking into the liquor department in Montgomery County, Maryland, ends up with me being covered by Loretta Tafani and by Bob Getlin, a young reporter for the Washington Star. And they're pumping out stories, and suddenly the Post determines that this is now Liquorgate. Well, hell, when they put a gate on, you know, the Post signals the world, this is a big story. And I'm thinking, what the hell's going on here? In the middle of all this, the county executive's aide is calling up and threatening to kill my children. I mean, you can't imagine. It was just... But Bob and I became very close. And when Woodward broke his word, what I had to do was when I made them fire me. I wasn't going to quit. And I said, they offered me jobs. Oh, no, we didn't. No, we didn't. He's a disgruntled job seeker. I said, the heck I am. And I called the reporters in Getlin and Susan Hedling from the Montgomery Journal and Loretta Tafani, and I said, look, this is nonsense. You guys know the quality of my work. You knew I was right on target. I said, look, listen to the tapes. Here are the job offers. I turned them down. You can hear me turn them down. You can't say anything about it. You can't say you heard the tapes, but you know the truth. Now do your reporting. Woodward told me for safekeeping I should give the transcripts to the Washington Post, meaning to Bob Woodward and to Loretta. So Loretta came out, and as a favor, because of our long relationship, I promised them all, if I ever released them, they'd all get it. She comes out, she types out the transcripts. Woodward promises he'll never use them unless I give him the okay. That's Tafani, Marinus, and Woodward's word. I did a deposition. I went under oath, and I told exactly the story that's on those tapes. I didn't even pick up the Washington Post. Esther Gelman, a county councilwoman from Montgomery County, calls me that morning after I've given out my deposition under oath, and she says, boy, you've got a great memory. And I said, Esther, what are you talking about? She said, well, read the Post this morning. So the Post story starts out and says, Colodny yesterday gave a deposition, and then they start quoting from the tapes, not from the deposition. And I nearly hit the ceiling. Doesn't say tapes, but there's no question. They leave the us in. I mean, it's there, and it's as phony as it can be. Anybody who has my deposition knows those exact words are not there. I called Loretta up, and I said, Loretta, how could you do this? We had an agreement. Len, I don't know what the agreement was. She was really uncomfortable. She was, do you mind if David calls you? So David Marinus calls me. David says, look, Len, we've got a problem. You know, the tapes are in the paper now. We're going to have to run a story tomorrow saying they're tapes. And I said, Bob, I said to David, David, look, we had a deal. You were part of the deal. Woodward's part of the deal. You're a part of the deal. You weren't going to release these until I said okay. You were keeping them for safekeeping. Okay. Len, would you mind if Bob Woodward called you? I said, look, I don't mind if the Pope calls me. The bottom line is we had an agreement. You've broken it. Rumors of these tapes have caused death threats to my kids over a 17-day period. The voices have been identified as the aide of the county executive and his brother, who's a policeman. My daughter's got to go into Montgomery, and you're putting me at risk? Will you talk to Bob? Well, I talked to Bob, and that tape will be part of the collection. Bob Woodward was something less than advertised. And he tried to convince me that we can't diddle our readers. They know it's tapes. Bob, what are the tapes doing in there? Well, you have to take that up with the reporter. And I called Bob Getlin up, and I said, the Post is going to run the tape story. I'm going to give you the tapes, and we're going to trump them. I always live up to my word, Bob, and I'm going to give you what's on those tapes, and you can run tomorrow morning. I know you come out a few hours later than the Post, but you'll have the story. And sure enough, Woodward did just what he said he was going to do. He screwed me. And then Getlin came out with a big headline on the Star which says, tapes prove Colodny job claim, and he trumped the Washington Post. At that point, Bob and I said, what in the hell is going on here? This is the icon? This is the great investigative reporter? Is this the way they treat sources? Did Deep Throat get treated this way?
Date this incident for us.
1980.
Okay.
November of 1980. And I said, Bob, something's wrong down there. I said, I know these reporters. They're honest. They're good. I mean, I went down the list. Margaret Shapiro, Jackson Deal. These are names today that you see all the time with Post bylines, overseas, wherever. And then the word started to spread. They had news inside the Metro section at the Post. Woodward can't handle it. Woodward doesn't. Every story has to be like Watergate. He cuts corners. Lawsuits are being filed by Mobil Oil against a Woodward project, which involved Pat Tyler, who was with the St. Pete Times down here before going to the Post. He had done a series on the Florida power companies, on the daisy chain stories. He got involved with Woodward in a tape and ended up being sued by Talaveras, who was the chairman of the board of Mobil Oil. The Janet Cook story. I mean, there it is. Woodward knew that it was a fraud. And when he was finally interviewed by the Post ombudsman, Mr. Green, who was doing an investigation of the Janet Cook story, which is, to our viewers understand, a young black reporter for the Post wrote this story about little Jimmy, an 8-year-old heroin addict. And the whole city was looking for this trial, and they couldn't find him. And it was a series, and they put it in for a Pulitzer Prize. And when they started to check her out after she won the Pulitzer Prize, they found out it never existed. Woodward's comments were remarkable to Mr. Green. Why did you put it in for a Pulitzer? David Mariner said, don't do it. He says, well, in for a dime, in for a dollar. What kind of journalism is this? And then comes the final quote from Woodward. Fake and fraud that it was a great story. And I started thinking, wait a minute. Watergate. Fake and fraud that it was a great story. And I'm supposed to believe that there's a guy in a garage and he's got a New York Times, and how does he get it in a flower pot he can't see? So what started out to be was a story of Woodward after Watergate. And that was the beginnings. Getlin and I started to try and put the pieces together of what happened to me and what were happening to other people at the Washington Post. And so that was how this project started. And that's how I went into it, the long story of how I became an investigative reporter.
And a good intro to the concept of what would follow from that, which is the years and time since spent on researching the Nixon presidency and the Watergate issues, and resulting in a New York Times best-selling book. But before we get there, just in passing it, and I'm not sure I want to make sure for our viewers that we understand it right. The relationship between you and Woodward started off as a positive relationship.
Oh, absolutely. I knew Bob Woodward. My mom was a precinct chairman in Montgomery County. She had a wonderful set of apartment complexes called the Blair House Complex. And they had a wonderful room where candidates would come, and my mom was the precinct chairman. In 1968, she turned out the highest percentage vote for Hubert Humphrey ever. 86% of her people voted. I think she did better than Mayor Daley did that year. And the Star wrote a big story about her. My mom, Ethel, was just terrific. And Woodward, as then a Montgomery Sentinel reporter, would be there. That's where I first met Bob. He was working for the Montgomery Sentinel.
So you and Bob Woodward had a long relationship.
Not a close relationship. Let's understand. We met each other. Certainly, I didn't know Bob Woodward in 1968.
Right.
In 1972. The way I would say I knew the other Post reporters. I had seen him in this time frame, 71, 70, in my mother's place while she was doing her precinct work, and I was introduced to him, but it was in passing. And then, of course, when he became famous, everybody said, oh, you remember him? He was the guy that was at your mom's club. And so, then everybody knew who Bob Woodward was.
So the relationship between, or the incidents and the events...
I like to say our paths crossed early.
Your paths crossed early. And in the crossing of those paths, as it moves toward the 1980 stuff that happened to you, and the publication of those stories and tapes that you've just recounted, did you, and it's interesting because I'm trying to connect to the passion and the causes and the growing up and the liberal democratic background you came from. Did it just strike you as conscious right from the very start when you started off with Getlin on what would become Silent Coup, that if it's Bob Woodward's story and that's what Watergate was for the whole country, Woodward and Bernstein, then by definition I'm going to find something very, very wrong?
No, quite the opposite. We both agreed we'd eliminate Watergate. We called it Woodward after Watergate. There was a reason for it, and there's a draft, which I will give as part of the collection. You will see it's Woodward after Watergate, subtitled The Anatomy of a Journalistic Fraud. But we decided that Watergate was, in fact, the real deal. First of all, I'm a liberal Democrat. I cheered Woodward every inch of the way. I thought All the President's Men was about the greatest thing that ever happened. I came from a home that hated Richard Nixon. I mean, my mother and father thought the House Un-American Activities Committee was a disaster. They were fans of Helen Gahagan Douglas, and the word Richard Nixon in my house was almost a cuss word.
Sure.
And so I was very, very steeped in anti-Nixon. So if Bob Woodward helped nail Nixon, and I would go out in '72 and we would I was running McGovern campaign in Prince George's County in 1972. And, when Watergate happened, well, my God, this was great. Of course, shortly thereafter, our candidate for vice president, Mr. Eagleton, had a shock treatment, and we all got a shock treatment in our party. So what can I tell you? It was rah, rah, Woodward, go for it. Nixon deserves this. This is, what goes around comes around, go get him. No, we wanted to give him that. Both Bob and I said, nah, that one he got right.
Given the size of the collection and that's coming to USF, and given the complexity of the subject matter in it, as well as the complexity of the subject matter in the book, one of the reasons we make this tape is to try to orient researchers and students, as I said in the introduction, to how to approach the collection. And in order to understand that, I think this conversation we're having, where you begin and how it got started, does that lead naturally, it does for me, to the subject of where did you begin the concept of research that led to Silent Coup?
Well, since we didn't know we were going to write Silent Coup, it started, as I explained to you. By 1984, we had a pretty good book. We had an agent. We had people who were scared to death of it. Nobody wanted to write anything negative about Bob Woodward, about Watergate and his coverage of Watergate. And so in the interim, I made a decision. My daughter had decided she wanted to leave Maryland. The death threats had scared her. She wanted to go to college, and she wanted to go to a college where there was a beach, and she threw a dart, and it hit Pinellas County. And the closest school that she could find was USF. Everybody, I apologize, but that's a true story. And that's how she moved down here to go to school. My wife packed her up and brought her down here. Went in one of those dorms with her and spent the night with her bug spray and whatever. And then we followed. In 1984, we came to Tampa. And I said to Bob Getland, I think I can do it better from Tampa than inside the Beltway. I've got all that Washington experience. I don't need the pressures of inside the Beltway, and I think I can interview better outside the Beltway. I think my long-distance calls will get returned better than if I call from inside. And I needed a change of scenery. So we came to Tampa and worked for a year, and out comes a book called Secret Agenda. And Secret Agenda was written by a fellow named Jim Hogan. And it began to put the Woodward-Watergate story together, the relationship of Woodward to Alexander Haig. And I called Bob up and I said, this is it, we're going to have to tear the damn thing up. I said, we can't ignore Watergate. Now, this is 4 years into this project, and I've just said we have to tear it up. New Year's Eve, 84, 85, Bob flew down here, and we sat in a restaurant in Tampa, and we tore it up. We had to go back to the drawing board and start all over again, and that was the true beginnings of Silent Coup, because we had now made the determination we weren't going to write Woodward after Watergate. We were going to re-examine Watergate like it had never been examined with the new information we had about his ethics and how he approached things. And now Hogan coming out, and Hogan took a horrible beating. I mean, they were ready for him. They ambushed him on the Today Show, and he didn't know what hit him. I've never seen anything like it. Mr. Gumbel, who's one of the nicest guys in the world, well, heck, they roll out a TV right in front of Hogan before he can even promote his book on the Today Show. And Carl Stern comes up and blasts him, one of Woodward's friends over at the Supreme Court, when Woodward was doing The Brethren. You might remember that's the second big book, second big story he had after Watergate.
Right.
So we took Hogan seriously, and he should be. He had written Spooks, which had been a bestseller, and he's a very accomplished journalist who works closely with 60 Minutes, and we tested his book, and it tested right. And we said, okay, we're off and running. And so in 1985, a very unknown nobody in Tampa started making calls to people like John Mitchell. And I can't explain to you how this worked and why I thought it would work, but I knew a friend of a friend in journalism who knew John Mitchell. So I said, could you get me his phone number? And this is like March of 1985, and I'm sure it's in the collection, so it'll be one of the first tapes you would go to. And I remember calling, and they said, global research or whatever it was called in those days. Would you have Mr. Mitchell return Mr. Colodny's call? And I left my phone number here in Tampa. And I forgot about it, for no phone call came back that day. And I remember running out to Eckert's. We were living at Landmark on Hanley in the apartments there at the time. And I ran up to Hillsborough and Hanley to the Eckert's that was there. And when I come back, my daughter says, "Well, John Mitchell called you." I said, "Oh, gee, this thing works. This is, and I got John Mitchell on the phone, and I start telling him what I know about Bob Woodward, and that's the hook, boy, because he, it turned out, believed Woodward was the rat in the woodpile with Haig all along, and he and Nixon had been, I didn't know this. And all of a sudden, the doors started open. And then it was Ehrlichman, and then it was Haldeman, then it was Dean, then it was this one and that one. And Dean really had loved it in the early days because I was looking for Deep Throat, and he had written Lost Honor in the 80s, where he tracked Deep Throat and came up with Al Haig. So we were all in tune. And that's how the book starts in 1985, 86. In 86, I got John Ehrlichman to go into the archives and take top-secret material out for me on the military spy ring, which is in the collection and in Silent Coup. So, boy, this worked. And it was kind of funny because you all know what Tampa's like. On Friday nights at dinner out many times with your neighbors. And everybody would sit around and we'd all say, "Well, what did we do this week?" Well, here I am. I'm not making a living. My wife is working in the U.S. Attorney's Office. She's putting me through graduate school, so to speak. And so we would all, they all thought I just stayed home and sent her out to work, and I was living off of her. They all had real jobs, so everybody would talk about it. So when it got to be my turn, I would say, "Well, I talked to John Mitchell today," and everybody said, "Oh yeah, sure you did, right." Why in the heck is John Mitchell talking to you? Why is John Ehrlichman? Why is any of these people talking to you? I said, "I don't know, but I'm building up a real good." "Oh yeah, Len, this is just the way you're lying to your wife. You're telling her this, but so she'll keep going to work." And so we had a joke. Shortly after that, in 1987, I invited Senator Gurney, who was on the Watergate Committee, and his wife, Leeds, to come over and have lunch with us. And so they did, and Ed and I got along real well. He was real interested in the project, and there'll be some of Ed in the collection. Fortunately, he's no longer with us, and the story of his victimization after Watergate is a great story, an important story. But that aside, when we went to dinner the next week, I said, "Oh yeah, last Saturday we had Senator Gurney and his wife, but don't worry, folks, I rented him for $2,500. This will keep Sandy working for another year." And everybody laughed at that, and they began to understand it. Actually, I did prove to my wife all these wonderful tapes that are in the collection. I said, "Let's go out on the patio and listen to John Mitchell." And so she knew I was really doing something. And without Sandy, there wouldn't have been a Silent Coup.
Walk me through the process of say an interview with John Mitchell. It's a little hard to grasp, even though you've said it, that an unknown, relatively speaking, by the time you hit Tampa.
Heck, I was unknown in Tampa. Forget about Washington.
Right. I mean,
I had my enemies, but they were all in Maryland.
Right. But going to call a major national figure, and the man returns your phone call, and so, okay, Mr. Colodny, this is John Mitchell. What did you do? What did you say?
Basically, I was dumbfounded that it worked, and more importantly, I just told him where I was. I was looking into Woodward, and we weren't looking at Watergate.
And you were taping the phone conversation.
Yes.
And he knew it?
No.
No.
No, and that's an issue, and we're free to discuss that issue.
Please, let's do that.
It would be better if I told you the methodology and why you don't tell someone they're being taped in an interview. In this book, and the way I approach interviews, and I was the principal interviewer, and I analyzed those interviews and then looked at all the materials and so on. Take a subject, any one of the subjects, let's take Woodward or what happened during Watergate or whatever. My methodology was pretty simple. I'd ask the same question of all the same people, the Haldemans, the Ehrlichmans, whoever it was. And whatever they told me, I believe to be true. We started at square one. Everything they tell me is true. Now,
can I stop you there?
Yeah.
That means to me that you had laid out all of the factual in sort of a schematic form, if nothing else. You would have had to have laid out all of the principal events of Watergate.
No, actually what I did was I really imposed on these people. I would take them where I was at that given time. If it was Woodward,
okay.
If it was Woodward and Hague, and what they knew about Woodward and Hague, or what they knew about the spy ring, or what they knew of.
So you had continuing conversations. There would be after conversations that would have had to have happened.
In the case of the collection is going to be. This is what makes it so marvelous. We start with Mitchell in 1985, and we go up to an hour before he dies in 1988.
Okay.
And there must be 100 hours of conversation. Now, a lot of it is chit chat, but I knew where I wanted to go, but I had to have a methodology. I had to know, in order to do this fairly, because I had a problem. After all, Woodward did something to me. Is this going to be perceived as a hatchet job on Woodward to get even for what he did to me? We couldn't have that. And so that was one rule. The other rule is that whatever I was told was true. Then we would do a series of things. We would match what I was told to what they had said in other forums, what they had written in other forums, what other people had to say about those other forums, taking the same event. And we would continually take the evidence and match it to what we believed the truth was, meaning the given truth, not the real truth. And when we started to find the contradictions, so if Dean says something over here, or Mitchell says something over here, or Haldeman, and then lo and behold, evidence comes up that that's not true, I can then go back and confront them.
Let me ask you for a comment about the most obvious glaring one that has appeared in the local Tampa Tribune coverage of these kinds of issues. It is the confession by John Dean that he did not write Blind Ambition. But I don't want to ask you about that so much as give me an example of something glaring, one of the first early glaring inconsistencies, say of a John Mitchell or a Haldeman or an Ehrlichman or a Woodward.
You've hit on one that's just perfect. John Dean said a lot of things in a lot of places. So I know it's controversial, but let's talk about it a little bit. John Dean was taken at face value. Those interviews, those first interviews. I mean, he wanted to get me an agent. He wanted to write the foreword to the book. He was so excited about this project. But as we moved into the Watergate thing, he would say things. So I would read Blind Ambition, his book. I would read his Senate Watergate testimony, his House Judiciary testimony, his testimony in the U.S. v. Mitchell trial. So I was looking at everything. Now, by the time he writes his book, all this other testimony should be in the book.
Right.
And there was things that didn't make sense. In his testimony, he says Liddy told him there was no White House involvement. In his book, he says Liddy told him Strawn was involved. Now, wait a minute. That's a different story. If you know Gordon Strawn's involved from day one, that's a totally different story. Strawn being Haldeman's aide, who would have pre-break-in knowledge. That's a pretty big deal. Now, that's just an example. That's an example when John Dean was confronted with his contradictions in deposition form, as they will be in the collection. What he does is, then he says, the book's a lie. But as a journalist, I started out with his version, since we didn't do it, the interview first. I read his testimony first. Well, if he's telling the Watergate Committee one thing, and he's telling the Judiciary Committee another thing, and another thing here, and another, and then when he finally is confronted in a lawsuit he brought, he disowned his book. In the front of his book, he says, this is it. This is the history. This is what really happened. I'm on the box. I'm on the lie detector. I'm going to tell you the truth. This is a sociopath. When he looks you right in the eye and says, I didn't write it, a Pulitzer Prize-winning ghostwriter made it up. What was even stranger was the part he made up turned out to be true. Because Gordon Liddy, who hadn't written at the time, he was still in jail when Dean wrote what Liddy had said, is the part he says Taylor Branch made up. When Liddy wrote 4 years later, after it was made up by Taylor Branch, he told the same story. So you know it's a lie.
Right.
And that's the significance. There's a real significance in this lawsuit that Dean would give up his own book.
Before we talk about the lawsuit, because we haven't identified it yet, let me ask if in the collection, specifically, I or somebody in our viewing audience, after looking at this tape, walks to the actual Colodny collection on the Nixon presidency, are they going to find a layout of those discrepancies that you've just described? Are they going to find in the research notes Len's highlighting of this evidence versus this versus that? Is that going to show?
What we did was, on every given subject, I made up what's called an evidentiary package. And so we took all the contradictions, or forget contradictions, even those things that bolster on a given subject, and we did it by subject. So you will have Dean on Strawn, no, maybe, yes, Taylor Branch made it up. You'll have all of that in one. You'll have the actual Senate testimony that I worked from and highlighted from. You'll have it all, because that's the methodology. If you follow the book, if you don't start with Dean, you start at the beginning of the book in 1985 and follow it through, you're going to hear a lot of interesting things. It's raw data. You are being given the rawest of raw data. You're going to hear words you just as soon not hear, maybe.
And none of which are going to be on this tape.
But the fact of the matter is, that's the way the real world is, and that's the way a real conversation is. I am not a Q&A guy. I'm a conversation guy. Let's start talking. And once you start talking, you begin to get to the real person. I also had to put a monitor on myself and not let my ego get in the way of this book. I had to realize that John Mitchell, John Ehrlichman, Bob Haldeman, John Dean, all of these people were no longer in power. So the arrogance that was clearly there in the Nixon administration doesn't show up on these tapes.
That's an interesting observation.
Because people in power are much more arrogant. Once they've been humbled a little bit and they're out, and you have, a journalist have to keep that in mind. They're wanting to put their spin on it. They don't want to appear to be a nasty guy. And they also have a story they want to tell, and they'd like you to tell it their way. So you are not talking to the rough, tough Chief of Staff Bob Haldeman. You're talking to a reflective Bob Haldeman and a reflective John Ehrlichman and a friendly version of the tough son of a bitches that were in that White House. You know, that was the real crime, and we'll get to that in the Nixon years. But I had to keep that monitor on all the time. Now remember, Len, what you're getting, you're going to hear other stories from other people. Don't discount them, because maybe you like John Mitchell. Maybe he has a nice sense of humor. He invited your daughter up to lunch or whatever. You've got to be, that monitor had to be on all the time, or Silent Coup was not going to be what it should be. And so using that methodology, which I really learned from police work, when a policeman starts out, he gets two versions of a story. He believes both of them, and then he starts to see if the evidence matches. It's very scientific. It's not something that you're pulling out of thin air. This is a methodology that most investigative reporters don't do. There was a great one who did something very similar, who I studied, and I think is still the best, I.F. Stone. He didn't have to go out and do the kind of, he didn't meet people in garages, but he would sit and take disparate pieces and make great investigative stories. Bob Sherrill, another one who was a great help in Silent Coup. That kind of reporter who didn't need to have a source said. And I was determined we weren't going to write a book that said a source said unless it was absolutely 100%. I couldn't get the story any other way. So out of 150, 160 people that we interviewed, they're all identified except for 5. And I think now they're all identified. So you will have everybody. You'll have the Chuck Colsons. You'll have Tony U. Lazowitz, who, by the way, has a lot of important new information to tell you about himself and his relationship unknown to John Dean. You're going to learn from Jack Caulfield. These are the sort of the sub-characters that were around this historic event. So I had to understand everybody had an agenda, everybody had where they were coming from, and they were talking, and I wanted to keep them talking. So you will see Mitchell 3.5 years, Haldeman 6, 7 years, and the tapes will span it. Follow the tapes. It was Follow the Money, which is a funny line in the movie. Never happened. Read the book, All the President's Men. It ain't in there because it was never said. Some guy thought it would look good in the movie, and it's now quoted as history. Follow the tape, and let me give you a clue. I used Haldeman, Ehrlichman, and Mitchell as what I call control interviews. If I asked one the question, I'd ask the same question of the other two. If one brought up something and then I was taking it seriously, I would then take it seriously. So all the subject matter will be contained in those three guys. Now, obviously, Mitchell dying in 1988, we don't get to call girl rings and stuff like that. But the fact of the matter is, those were the guys, since I talked to them most often, those would be what I call control tapes.
Did you talk to these people personally, or was this all a process of phone conversations? I
met Mitchell. I did one interview with Mitchell and Len Garment in Len Garment's office. I wanted a tape recorder running, and Garment wouldn't let it. And one day we'll all explain that. I met John Ehrlichman after I wrote the book. Almost all this was by telephone. I had a theory, and my theory, and I know it's controversial, and I wear the word controversial as a badge of honor. And I'll tell you why. Not because I'm right, but the only people in my lifetime that ever got anything done were controversial. They didn't get elected to office and say, the next thing I have to worry about is how I get reelected. The people in my lifetime who made a difference were Martin Luther King, who was elected to nothing, and by the way, very controversial, even amongst us Jews who were busy supporting civil rights. Why does he have to move so fast? Type of thing, to Ralph Nader. I could go down the list of individuals who are extremely controversial, but they make things happen. So I love the tag. In my opinion, telling somebody that you're running a tape recorder, you might just as well get a script. There's nothing unethical on those tapes. It's my conversation, and as Bob Sherrill told me, he said, Len, if you're going to do this kind of book, you've got to have the documentation. You just absolutely, especially coming as an unknown. But he said, you're doing history, and so you've got to tape. And he was right. He was absolutely right. And
in every place that you did it, and in every circumstance, and across the spectrum of years that it took you to produce it, was there ever a concern on your part that not disclosing the tapes, that you were taping these conversations?
No, but you will notice on the tapes, certainly in the first conversations, and everybody should be aware of this, they are told up front, this is an on-the-record interview for a book. They are told that up front. Every single tape you'll hear, you will hear that, so they understand they're on the record. They understand that everything they say to me, I can republish.
Did you ever have the impression that they were working from notes or research while talking to you on the phone, or was this all a matter of personal
recollections? Oh, no, I had a lot of fun with them. I would send them, fax them. That fax machine, when I would do a portion of a piece of evidence, I'd fax it to them and say, let's look at it and we'll talk about it on the phone. So that would go on constantly.
That's probably very helpful.
It was very helpful. When Mitchell was alive, we were trying to get to President Nixon. You'll have a hand draft of his letter to Nixon and the actual document that went to Nixon in 1987. So you're going to have all of this, but you'll also see and you'll hear us talking about their books. They'll have their book open, and I'll be reading them a portion and asking them how that jives with this or how that jives with that. That's how I got in trouble with Dean. I started asking Dean questions about evidence, and then we had real problems.
Again, before we get to Dean and the difficulties, in the tapes themselves, the physical element now, in the collection you've given to us, are the tapes transcribed? Are they in paper form, or are they just videotapes? Some percentage? What?
The vast majority are already transcribed, and they're also on CD-ROM for your computer. And I assume we'll work the technicalities out on that. And they're on audio tape. And you can match the audio tape. You can listen to the audio tape. But my advice to anyone researching is, if you're going to look at one person, start with that person from the beginning. Stick with the subject you're looking for. If you're on a subject, go from Mitchell to Haldeman to whoever fits that subject. And then see what they all have to say. And then listen, because I identify the evidence I'm working from. I'll say, I got John Mitchell to read parts of Gordon Liddy's book. He thought Gordon Liddy was a nut. Gordon Liddy ends up in will confirming a lot of information. I remember walking into Mitchell's office carrying all the president's men and final days, and there's a picture of Mitchell with a pipe on all the president's men, and I thought the secretary was going to have a heart attack. You really here to see Mr. Mitchell? I said, well, he said I could bring the books. So, yeah, I got them to read stuff they'd never read before. And so as a result, I would Xerox it and then put it in the fax machine and then say, I'm going to call you in a couple of days, please. Or I'd send Bob Haldeman a packet out to the coast and say, well, please review this. I want to talk to you about it. This was constantly going on.